think that is it takes away one layer of separation, where there's a possibility of someone pointing a finger or using it as a differentiating factor, saying, oh, look what they sound like. And as you rightly mentioned, the stereotypes, right, which would enter the room way before the individual. And that would be, in some cases, funny, in some cases, an uphill battle for the individual to say, you know what, as you mentioned, for the students who are like, you know what, I really wanted to ask you the question, but I couldn't. But how much um, of a role does technology with, as you mentioned, Google Translate or these AI-enabled tools, where, especially in the communication space, with real-time translation or with various things in the language space, how much of a role have they played in enhancing communication between individuals, and also on a business scale? How much can a business leverage these communication tools to be more effective?
That's a great question. Obviously, with the advancement in technology, and it's interesting because I remember like the very first time that I started to use Google Translate while I was traveling. It wasn't particularly accurate. It wasn't
Mhm.
great. You could barely get by. And I mean, nowadays it's one of those things where it's like it is. I'm going to call it. The last time that I've used it, I would say that it's pretty close to almost real time communication. You can even have little headphones where it's actually translating back and forth in your ears. So I think that really makes the world smaller, which is really nice.
Right.
But I would even say that other technologies too have sort of brought about different cultural perspectives. When we think of something like social media and the accessibility of music from other countries or from global from global cultures and things like that, that is now coming through on things like TikTok or in Instagram Reels. I think that's really opened some space to be like, oh wow, that's really awesome. I really like that. Who is that? Oh, that's a Korean pop band. Oh, very cool. Let's listen to some more like that. And it really is kind of shortening the distance in between different cultural aspects and creating appreciations for different cultural aspects. We've always had sort of a culinary approach to it, like, oh, I really like these types of foods and things like that. But now I think that it's not just the United States that's exporting its media or exporting its music and television shows and so on and so forth. Netflix, for example, is giving us access in the United States to a lot of shows that are being done and created and cultivated by different artists from around the world. And that's also, I think, something helping to really shorten that distance between the different cultures or different geographies.
Yeah. You I mean, it's fascinating how, I was just thinking about this the other day, and the evolution of language, and how, say, a country like India has so many languages, right? Within a state, there are different languages, dialects, and within the country as a whole, it's even broader. And then you kind of have, on a global stage, so many languages. But with now all these things changing, as you just pointed out, the shortening of distance from earlier because of technology and social media and these tools, I wonder where we are heading with also the restriction on freedom of speech by certain groups of people because of various sensibilities or various philosophies or ideologies being offended or violated according to them. Like, on one front, you have this constant need for human expression and to communicate, and on the other side, you have this restrictive nature of it. So I almost feel like, are we heading towards a model of hybrid language where, it's kind of encompassing everything that we've experienced so far as a species, yet it takes into account this electronic aspect? I don't know. I'm kind of fascinated with where this might go.
I, you know, the speed at which technology is being deployed these days. If we like look at modern innovations, and we even go back to say, let's go back to when the car was created and launched, and you're talking 100 years ago, and the combustion and so on and so forth, and the Model A or the Model T, etc. And
Yeah.
then you look to other innovations that were really game changing, and you think like television, and you think radio, etc. And then all of a sudden you look in the last 20 20 years, and you start to see things like the iPhone, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, et cetera, the speed at which technology is really being deployed. I mean, I remember being a kid and watching the Jetsons and thinking that an opportunity to like talk to somebody while their face was on a TV and my face was on a TV, I was like, wow, that technology is so cool. That'll never exist. And
Yeah.
here we are doing exactly that, across the world from each other. So the speed at which technology is being deployed really is having a huge impact on behaviors, on culture. That's a big part of what I like to study, is trying to understand, okay, we've got these hardwired neurological functions from our species being developed over 185,000 years. Only 6,000 years of that is actually like civilized. Only 20 years of that is the internet. 20 or 30 years of that has the internet. Like how quickly we are advancing in a very different space at this time. So it'll be really interesting to kind of watch the progress on how these things impact the way that we communicate, the way that we lead, the way that we run companies, the way that we manage our day-to-day affairs, etc. Because we have no idea what technology is going to exist in 2033, let alone how we're navigating some of those things now. So it's really fascinating to look at.
Yeah, yeah, as you pointed out, 6,000 years of civilization and maybe 20 years, 30, 40 years of the internet. How many, um, and how many massive changes have happened? Because I see this happening where there's this uh, where people are gravitating to their natural, if you want to call it, their mother tongues, right? You see this pride battle happening, where in India there are so many languages, I pointed out. But there's Hindi, which is one of the national languages, there's official languages, sorry. And then you have people in the south who speak Tamil, and there's Kannada, and I'm sure you've come across various different languages spoken in India. And one thing which I find a little restrictive for human expression and growth is this: my language is better than yours. And people kind of hold on to that. And there's Sanskrit, which is also like Latin and Greek, the older languages, right? And many people are like learning that because in some way, yes, there are texts that can be interpreted truly through that language, but it's also a pride thing. And again, I feel pride in this context might be a barrier to communication, because you're not willing to look past the language element and not focus on how to communicate effectively, but hold on to some kind of a notion that you are coming to this conversation or to this encounter with a chip on your shoulder.
It's an interesting point, because when we think about it, and throughout the course of our, we'll call it civilized history, right? So language, our species has been on the planet for 180, 185,000 years. And language really, I mean, the first known fossil evidence of language is what, 40,000 years ago.
Mm.
So we existed without sort of written communication or a formal set of communication in some way, shape, or form for many, many years. And over the course of the last 40,000 years, you've had different dominant regimes. You've had, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, etc. And when you had some of those different dominant spaces, there was sort of an expectation of, okay, well, that is, they run the economies, they run the global trade, they run these different things, and having to adapt to it. But I think that there was always some level of resistance of people maintaining their own cultural identities, maintaining their own language identities.
Mm.
I think as the world has gotten smaller with technology and being able to travel, etc., it seems to me that there's probably space for both. Being able to have some form of a universal currency of language, right? And whether
Yeah.
that's English, or whether, in 10 years, that's a different language, or, 100 or 200 years, that's a different language. I think it's essential that we have some level of capacity to communicate with each other. But I also think it's beautiful to be able to hold on to some of those cultural traditions. And, assimilation is not necessarily a positive thing. I think you lose something with it. When we think about like some of the dead languages or languages that no longer exist, or that there's very, very few people on the planet that actually speaks that language. One of my dear friends from Estonia is a linguist, and she talks about how the constructions of language actually can tell you like historical context, the way that the way that masculine or feminine shows up in the language, the way that objects are spoken about, gives actual like almost like this archaeological insights into some of the cultural values that a tribe or that a culture or that a geography would have had. So I
Mm.
hope that we don't lose those things, but I hope they also don't necessarily get in the way of being able to say, hey, it's okay for us. And this is where I'm a little bit prouder of the United States, because there is more of an interest in other cultures and language and learning other language that wasn't exactly, we weren't necessarily pushed for that when I was younger. And I see more of that push happening now of like, no, it is really important that we learn multiple languages so that we have this opportunity to really connect with other cultures around the globe.
Yeah, I find that quite amazing, right? That a language is, brushed over with the broad brushstroke when it's like, oh, you just say, as you said, Spanish or English, and then you just move on to how it's spoken. But these things of what it depicts of the time where that language was born and the journey of the group of people who spoke that language, I find that amazing, and it's such an injustice not to know that, right? Because sometimes even in addition to English, I speak the local language of the state I live in, which is Kannada, and while I do speak it, I don't sometimes understand, because I try to make the English conversion to Kannada and I kind of use that context. But if you actually say it the way it's meant to be said, the interpretation is so much broader that it has a completely different meaning, and I find that quite amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Language is one of those things where we take it for granted. I think sometimes we take for granted some of the nuances of individual languages. And even like, for example, I speak very, very poorly, but I do speak Spanish.
Hmm.
I found out that I speak it better than I thought, though, when I've been, transported to Guadalajara, Mexico, and I'm in a country for 7 days. By about day 3 or 4, my Spanish language skills have come back, and I've started to utilize them. And now all of a sudden I can have a 45-minute conversation with somebody. Still, I'm sure that in my brain, I've experienced that of going, I wonder what I sound like right now, or this is not particularly good, but generally it's still respected that you're attempting to speak a language in another culture. So, but it was a very different experience when, say, I traveled to Cuba when the United States had opened up those borders. And while it is Spanish, it is a very, very different Spanish, and it is done at different speeds, with different intonations, with different context, with different values behind some of the different words of the language. And so yeah, we can all speak a similar language and still come to it from very different cultural dimensions, which is like I said, still really fascinating and something to be proud of, I think.
Yeah.
Not something that, it is something I think that it is possible to be proud of and still say, hey, you know what? We can modify ourselves or help our, we can be a little bit more. I know that if I'm speaking to somebody whose English is a second language, simply slowing down and
Mm.
simply taking a little bit of additional time, not necessarily speaking louder, but slowing it down just a little bit can really make a huge impact. Because in the general sender receiver model, it's like a messenger sends a message, the receiver receives it, codes it, decodes it, and sends it back. When there is different languages at play, there's extra steps in there. It's the receiver gets it, translates it, makes meaning of it, translates it back into whatever the original language is, and then responds to the message. So simple things like cultural, and from a cultural adaptability, is slowing down, making sure that we are clearly enunciating to the best of our ability in whatever dialect or accent that we have, makes
Mm.
a meaningful difference in our ability to connect with each other.
Mm. It's interesting you mentioned that, because I, coming from this comedy, stand-up comedy performance point of view, when I get called for shows in India, many times people ask, specifically like an English-speaking comedian, and when I ask them about the client and the audience in the show, I ask them, are they comfortable in English? They're like, yeah, yeah, they're all educated. I'm like, see, that's not what I asked, right? Because there's this notion that if you speak English, you're educated, which I think is wrong. Um, but there's this difference where someone like me who thinks in English but also speaks Kannada, but there are people who think in Kannada but speak English. So it's very difficult, like as you just pointed out, when I'm doing jokes, when I'm telling jokes to people who think in a different language but speak English, there is that lag, there is that time difference almost, and subtle nuances or references are lost because it's such a big difference. Because even though you might say the same words that they know, the way it's being interpreted is very, very different. And I see this
Yeah.
now with international shows. I Because for me, it's always been a dream to perform around the world, and I saw English as a language that's spoken everywhere in the world, but it's spoken, number one, differently, of course, but it's also understood differently. Because even in Norway, there may be people who speak Norwegian, but they might think in English, or vice versa. So when you go and do these shows, you have to keep that in mind. But what I'm noticing now is because of these different forms of, say, English, the Indian English or the um, South Asian way of speaking English, there are people traveling, say, from India or from wherever the language, and doing it for their kind of English speaking audiences anywhere in the world. So they might go to Australia and perform only for Indians over there because of the language connect. And I mean English, of course, but in an Indianized, familiar home sense of, oh, I feel at home because I'm being spoken to, told jokes to in this form of English I'm comfortable with.
It's so funny that you mentioned that, and you brought up a memory of mine that I went to a comedy show actually in Iceland when I was in Reykjavik,
Mm-hmm.
and they had some native English as a first language speaker, American comedians that were there, but they also had some Icelandic speakers, and it was so fascinating to me to watch, as the native, the American comedian that got on there. There was a couple of times that a certain joke would drop and I would laugh, and then it would
Mm.
take a second, and then all of a sudden the rest of the group would start laughing,
Right.
and vice versa happened when it was a Icelandic native that was speaking English, that they would say something, and like for me I was lost, and they were doing
Mm.
it in English, and like I didn't get the joke, and like a bunch of people are around me are laughing, and I'm like, okay, I missed something there. And, usually it was like either a play on words that, the English language sounded like an Icelandic saying or something like that. And it really had different meaning and just very clever. And it was just like somebody did have to explain that to me.
Right.
So, comedy is one of those things too. And I am not a comedian, but I like to deploy humor in my talks.
Right.
Is one of those things where you got to be mindful, because different audiences are going to definitely react to different jokes, or to different styles, or to different meanings in a very different way. So I applaud you, Sophie. That's awesome that you're taking that international approach to it. That's got
It,
to be incredible and fun, and a challenge, I'm sure.